If you search for attachment therapy expecting to find information about therapy that draws on attachment theory, the work of Bowlby, Ainsworth, and that tradition, you'll find something very different and disturbing. Attachment therapy is a specific term with a specific history, and that history involves physical coercion, documented harm, and the deaths of children. That's not hyperbole. So this video is going to explain what attachment therapy actually refers to, where it came from, why its theoretical premises are wrong on their own terms, and at the end, what legitimate therapy informed by attachment theory actually looks like, because that does exist and it's worth distinguishing clearly. Hello and welcome to Attachment Maps. My name is Carl and I'm here to tell you things that no one else is talking about. Attachment therapy goes by many names. Holding therapy, rage reduction therapy, rebirthing therapy, compression therapy, corrective attachment therapy, coercive restraint therapy, and the evergreen model. Partly because each time one label accumulates a bad enough reputation, practitioners move to another. The target population was primarily adopted and foster children who were thought to have attachment disorder, a condition involving severe difficulty forming bonds with caregivers, typically following early neglect, abuse, or institutional deprivation. The core claim was that these children had become so defended, so shut down emotionally, that conventional therapeutic approaches couldn't reach them. What was needed, the argument went, was something more forceful, a way to break through the child's defenses and create an attachment bond where none had formed. The practice it produced involved physically restraining children, often across the therapist's lap, and deliberately provoking them into intense emotional states. Sessions could last hours. The goal, in the language of the practitioners, was cathartic release of suppressed rage, after which the child would supposedly be able to bond with caregivers. The first is Robert Zaslow, a California psychologist who developed what he called Z-process therapy in the 1970s, originally targeting autistic children. Zaslow's approach involved physical restraint and deliberate provocation of rage, based on the idea that the child's behavioral problems were caused by suppressed emotional material that needed to be forcibly released. Zaslow surrendered his license in 1971 after a patient was injured during a session. The second is Foster Cline, a psychiatrist who encountered Zaslow's work and adopted it at his clinic in Evergreen, Colorado in the mid-1970s. Cline applied the approach to adopted and foster children labeled with attachment disorder, building a network of practitioners around what became known as the Evergreen model. The phrase most associated with Cline's view, that some of these children needed their brains washed, gives a reasonable indication of the underlying orientation. The practice spread during the 1980s and 1990s, particularly in communities around adoption and foster care, and received at various points uncritical media coverage, including daytime television appearances. The central premise of attachment therapy, that you can force a child into attachment through physical confrontation and emotional catharsis, is not just unsupported by evidence. It's directly contradicted by what attachment theory actually says. Bowlby's core argument was that the attachment system is a biological system whose function is to maintain proximity to a safe caregiver under conditions of threat. When a child is frightened, the attachment behavioral system activates. The child seeks proximity, comfort, and protection. A caregiver who responds reliably, sensitively, and safely to that bid for protection is what builds a secure attachment relationship over time through repetition. Now consider what attachment therapy does. It physically restrains a child. It deliberately induces fear and rage. It puts the child in a position of absolute helplessness, and it does this in the presence of an adult who is the source of that fear, which is precisely the environmental configuration that Ainsworth's research associated with disorganized attachment, not secure attachment. In Mary Main's framework, disorganized attachment develops when the caregiver is simultaneously the child's source of fear and their only available source of protection. The caregiving environment becomes incoherent, and the child has no workable strategy. Attachment therapy doesn't correct this, it reproduces it. The child is threatened and restrained by the very adult who is supposed to become their safe person. The idea that this would produce bonding is not just unproven, it runs directly against the theoretical framework it claims to be based on. The blocked rage theory that trauma creates a buildup of suppressed anger that prevents bonding and must be released through catharsis has no basis in developmental attachment literature. It draws from fringe psychoanalytic ideas that mainstream psychology had moved away from well before attachment therapy itself was established. The practice has resulted in at least 6 documented child deaths in the United States. The most well-known case is that of Candace Newmaker, a 10-year-old girl who died on April 18, 2000 in Evergreen, Colorado. Candace had been adopted at the age of 7 by a nurse from North Carolina who believed she was suffering from reactive attachment disorder and sought intensive treatment. The treatment involved, over several days, sessions of physical restraint and what practitioners called rebirthing, a procedure in which Candace was wrapped tightly in flannel sheets, surrounded by pillows, and told to push her way out to simulate being born, while 4 adults used their hands and feet to press down on her body. The session was videotaped as a matter of standard practice. The footage shows Candace saying repeatedly that she cannot breathe, that she is dying. The session lasted 70 minutes. She was found unresponsive, was airlifted to a hospital in Denver, and was declared brain dead. She died the following day from asphyxiation. The 2 lead therapists, Connell Watkins and Julie Ponder, were convicted of reckless child abuse resulting in death and sentenced to 16 years in prison. Colorado subsequently passed Candace's law banning rebirthing techniques. North Carolina passed its own law in 2003. A U.S. Senate resolution passed condemning the practice. In 2006, the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children published a formal task force report on attachment therapy, largely condemning its practices as having no empirical support and posing serious risks of physical and psychological harm to children. Variants of these practices have continued to surface since then under different names, often in contexts involving adopted and foster children, making the naming problem an ongoing one. So what does legitimate therapy informed by attachment theory actually look like? It looks like the opposite of this. Evidence-based, attachment-informed interventions, programs like Circle of Security, Watch, Wait, and Wonder, and others work by supporting the caregiving relationship directly. They help parents become more sensitive and attuned to their child's signals. They help caregivers understand what a child's behavior is communicating. They create the conditions under which trust can develop gradually through repeated, safe, responsive interactions. These approaches don't force anything. They recognize that attachment develops from the child's side in response to an environment that is proven safe enough to depend on. You cannot compel a child to trust you. You can only behave in ways that make trust the reasonable conclusion over time. If you've encountered the term attachment therapy and wondered whether it had anything to do with attachment theory, the answer is that it borrowed the name and built on almost none of the science. What Bowlby described, a child reaching out toward a caregiver and finding a reliable, responsive person there, is about as far from physical restraint and provoked rage as it's possible to get. Hey guys, pretty soon YouTube is going to make it even harder for YouTube creators to support themselves. If you like this content, please subscribe and share it with friends. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.